I'm Ilana Nimz. I'm an arborist, tree worker, and also a wildlife biologist here in Hawaii. I specialize in marine birds, so like white terns are partially my specialty, but I also study other birds here and have recently been getting into the Hawaiian hoary bat. So today I'll be going over the endangered birds and bats here, as well as our invasive species in Hawaii. We're a little bit different than maybe the North American side of things, where most of the birds that you encounter in our urban environment are not actually supposed to be here. So I just wanted to start off that there are definitely laws to protect wildlife in Hawaii, and that's because Hawaii is the bird extinction capital of the world. We had, similar to the Galapagos, a bunch of songbirds that radiated out and became very specialized on certain trees and insects, and with humans and introduced species, we barely have any forest birds left, and it's pretty sad. So there are two federal laws that are the big ones: the Endangered Species Act, which most of you are familiar with, but it was established to protect and recover imperiled ecosystems and their species. And this is administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which does have a presence here in Hawaii. And also the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which makes it unlawful to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, or sell birds that are listed as migratory birds. And all of Hawaii's native birds are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And on top of all that, the state of Hawaii has its own set of administrative laws, which can be found in Title 12, Subtitle 4, which basically protects the birds as well, and bats. So let's get started with the Hawaiian hoary bat, or Ope'epe'a, and it is a subspecies of the North American hoary bat, and it kind of arrived to Hawaii over 1 million years ago and just found its way over here, probably lost in a storm. And it's Hawaii's only native land mammal. So our other native mammal is the Hawaiian monk seal, but on land, it's the Hawaiian hoary bat. And surprisingly, most people in Hawaii don't even realize that we have bats. And that's because they're endangered and really hard to find, and not much is known about them. But their Hawaiian name means half leaf, and that's because their wing resembles the bottom of a kalo or taro leaf, as you can see in that picture. And the veins of the leaf are like a bat's fingers. And they're pretty small, only about 4 inches long, and their wingspan is 12 inches. So they are tiny. So their biology, just some basic facts here. They are nocturnal. They feed on insects, so not fruits like many people are familiar with fruit bats, but these guys are insectivores. And a USGS study found that they will leave their roost anywhere from an hour before sunset to go out and forage, and can arrive anywhere from an hour to 11 minutes before sunrise. And so they use echolocation to locate native and non-native insects. And actually a lot of what they eat is non-native insects, and they'll fly through the air and with their feet capture an insect and then kind of fold in on themselves and eat it midair, kind of do a tumble and then go on with their merry way, getting more insects. So it's pretty amazing. And they are found in trees. Unlike other bats, they roost, not cave roosters, they're tree roosters. And they have been found in trees that are anywhere from 9 to 56 meters in height, and found roosting anywhere from 5 to 24 meters. So they have been found in native and non-native trees, and they kind of tuck into the leaves, as you see in that picture. So that's from the ground looking directly up into the bat's face, basically, on top of its head. So you're looking up into the leaves to find them. So for Hawaii people, these are some of the roost trees that bats have commonly been found in. And of all of these, only one of the trees is native. The first one, Ohia lehua. They've been found here on the Big Island. And next we have paper barks, some lychees, malokias, these Australian tunes, which kind of surprised me because they don't have a very thick canopy, but they've been found roosting in them. Mango trees and gunpowders are some common ones. In general, they like the lychee trees, these really thick foliage, so they can kind of tuck up into the leaves and be protected from the heat. So bat reproduction, their peak pupping season is from June 1st through September 15th. And they can pup outside of this period, but this is the peak time. And the mother bat can have 1 or 2 pups and cares for them. And she leaves the pups in the tree and forages at night and will make several foraging trips. So she'll go out, get some insects, bring them back to her pups. And the pups remain with their mother for about 2 months. So within the first week, they can be held on her and moved around, but after a week or so, they're a little too big for her to move around. So she leaves them in the tree, and then at about 2 months, they can fly, but they're still dependent on the mother for feeding. So this is a state and federally listed endangered species, and that's because it has many threats. One of the biggest threats to the bats is collisions with man-made structures. In particular, if you're in Hawaii, you've probably heard a lot about the wind turbines. So at night when they're foraging, they can just run into the turbines and get smacked and fall, and it's been a big source of controversy for wind power in Hawaii. In addition to wind power, barbed wire fencing can harm them because they're just zipping around at night and can get tangled and speared by the barbed wire. And similarly, communication towers, they can run into them. Additional habitat changes have impacted the bats. While they seem to roost in a bunch of trees, if a lot of their habitat is getting fragmented, that can definitely impact them. But I think the biggest issue with bat conservation is lack of information. They're extremely hard to locate. There's not much known about their populations, and they are fairly understudied on most of the islands except for the Big Island of Hawaii. So there have been a lot more studies going on, especially with the increase in wind power, but there's a lot more to learn about bats, including how to improve habitat for them and to increase their populations. And tree trimming can also be a hazard for the bats. And this is particularly during the pupping season when the young bats are unable to fly. And so if the tree is being pruned and bats are on a branch, they aren't able to leave like the adults. So they're very vulnerable to pruning. So the recommendations from the state of Hawaii and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this is found in the DLNR white paper document on hoary bats, which you can just Google that and you'll find this. So the current guidance is to not cut trees from June 1st through September 15th without an incidental take license and associated habitat conservation plan. So if this is the first time you're hearing this, this is probably your reaction, and I get this a lot, that you're not supposed to trim during the summer, but indeed, that is what the guidance is. So does this mean you can't work in the summer? Well, it's a little fuzzy. The bottom line is it's illegal to harm a bat. And to reduce any chance of killing a bat, they recommend just not trimming. And if you do need to trim during the summer, the recommendation is to consult with DLNR between these dates. And this is the phone number you can call to talk about your trimming situation with them. And if there's like a long-term project you're involved with that involves removing a lot of trees, you can look into getting an incidental take license, and they can be directed at this email address. There's the bats are a little challenging, and at the moment we're looking into ways to survey for them, but none of the survey methods have been approved by DLNR and Fish and Wildlife yet, so it's in progress. But at the moment, you can avoid trimming during this time. That's the recommendation. So moving on from bats to native forest birds, I'll just briefly touch on this. We have a big diversity of native forest birds here in Hawaii. We have 22 endemic forest bird species remaining, and 20 of them are listed as endangered. But in recent history, over 30 forest birds have gone extinct. And the biggest threats to the native forest birds are mosquitoes, and this causes avian malaria, which they're extremely susceptible to. In Hawaii, with climate change, mosquitoes are able to move higher up the mountains into higher elevations because they are restricted by temperature. So as the climate warms, mosquitoes are able to expand their range and basically push the bird range to the tops of these mountains until there's no more mountain left that's free of mosquitoes. I think there's some talks about introducing sterile mosquitoes into the environment to try to help this, but I don't know what the status is right now. Additional threats to forest birds would be like habitat loss, with ranching has removed a lot of native forests from some of the outer islands, and additionally urbanization has impacted this as well. And predation, cats, rats, mongoose, even pigs, by ruining the forests for these birds. So if you are an urban tree worker, you're very unlikely to encounter native forest birds in normal tree work, but if you are doing some work in the forest, especially on the neighbor islands, you could encounter some native forest birds. Next, I just want to talk about native snails because they're really cool. We have over 200 species of endemic snails in Hawaii, and over 700 species were described, but sadly most are extinct. And similar to the birds, these snails just like evolved these very specific niches and in very specific valleys and parts of the islands. So they're each quite unique and very threatened. Predation by carnivorous snails, like the rosy wolf snail, is a big one. And Jackson chameleons, which are rampant on all our islands, also attack these little guys. And habitat loss by forest fragmentation has been a major issue too, with so few individuals and them being split apart. It's hard for them to find ones of their kind. And again, these ones you're unlikely to encounter in your normal tree work, but if you are an avid hiker or just like being in the forest, these are things to look for. So moving on to introduced birds, we have about 32 species of introduced birds that use our urban or rural trees. And in your normal tree work, these are the ones you're going to be encountering. Not native, but just pretty birds that aren't supposed to be here. So things like house sparrows, house finches, we have some saffron finches, the cardinals, waxbills are all introduced to Hawaii from various reasons. Many could be escaped pets, or they just got here one reason or another. And Ryan touched on this, but within the introduced birds, there's a subset that are considered to be injurious by the state of Hawaii or federal. And these ones cause harm to agriculture in particular. So like the common myna, the shama, which Ryan showed you earlier. Parakeets are a big one on all the islands now. Chestnut munias, Java sparrows, which surprisingly in their native habitat in Indonesia, they are considered endangered, but here they're injurious. And then Majiro, the Japanese white-eye, and red-vented bulbuls. So there's another subset of categories within the introduced birds, and these are actually protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So even though they are introduced and invasive in Hawaii, they're still protected by federal law. So it is illegal to harm or possess these birds. And these are the ones on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that are present in Hawaii. So it's kind of weird. We're a weird state in that sense. But if you're not familiar with birds and working in trees, just know in the back of your mind that some are federally protected, and just do your best to protect all the birds. So in Hawaii, introduced birds are a little bit of an issue. I think it's past the point of doing anything about it. But their problem is they spread invasive plants in urban and forest environments, and then they can outcompete native species for habitat and food resources. So especially the Japanese white-eye is a particular one that outcompetes the smaller native finches and forest birds. They can impact agriculture and also transmit disease to native species. So just want to end with some final recommendations to just follow guidelines provided by state, federal, and professional organizations to protect wildlife in Hawaii. And even if it's not supposed to be in Hawaii, it could potentially be protected. And that's just a picture of an apapane. So with that, I can take any questions.
Yeah, I certainly have a couple of questions. Corey, have you seen any come in that you wanna jump in with yet?
No questions yet, but yeah, go ahead and ask your follow-ups.
All right, well, get out there and start asking some questions, people. We got the expert here. We need to make sure we get our money's worth today. I'm interested in the bat range, the Hawaiian hoary bat. Is it on every island? Are the regulations sort of all encompassing? Do we think that it exists less in urban areas, you know, downtown Honolulu than other areas? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, so the bats are found on every island. Some islands have higher populations than others. And on Oahu, they're really understudied, but Maui and the Big Island, there's several people doing research on the bats there, so they have pretty good ideas of their ranges, and it seems like they have a seasonal elevation change, and they are found in urban areas of the Big Island, but if you're familiar with Hawaii, urban on the Big Island is very, very different than urban on Oahu, like Honolulu. So yeah, it's it's still a work in progress with studying the bats on Oahu. There is not a good handle at all on their population, on where they roost, on where they are. There's studies that was done couple years ago, I think over the last 2 years, that put acoustic detectors throughout the island of Oahu to try to detect where they are. And acoustic detections picked them up over the entire island. But there seemed to be a seasonal change with the acoustic detections where they're concentrated more on the north and west side in the summer, and then they move throughout the island in the winter. But that doesn't mean they're not around the entire island in the summer. It just means the acoustic detections change. So there's a lot to learn about the bats. Did that answer all your questions?
Absolutely. I think it mostly covers the first question that came in as well, Corey. What do you think? Do you want to, piggyback on that on something?
No, agreed. Looks like it's still a work in progress, and that check back in with Ilana, it seems like.
I do think these acoustic detection devices, and more importantly, the software to analyze them, is getting so great all of a sudden, where I think that we'll have a lot more information on bats pretty soon, because the ability to process just like hours and hours of recording is happening so fast nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
definitely.
From Jolie Dollar about BMPs for the hoary bat. I think that DLNR does have BMPs for the hoary bat in terms of tree trimming. Do you know about those?
The BMP is don't trim. That's
okay.
That's all there is right now. And I can't give you any more information than that. Like, don't trim during the pupping season and call them to consult.
Ilana, I know that you're working on some protocols. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what those might be, or is it too early to say? And also, why don't you end your screen sharing so you're a little bigger for our audience here?
And let me do that. Stop sharing. So the bat, it's a little hard. It's not approved by DLNR Fish and Wildlife yet, but there is potential to detect bats thermally with thermal imaging. There was a study by USGS done on the Big Island in forest stands that they weren't able to detect, as had low detection rates with thermal. So that makes DLNR and Fish and Wildlife very hesitant to say that thermal is a viable option. My point of view, and I think some other people, is that forest stands of the Big Island are a completely different habitat than an urban pruned tree in Honolulu or on Oahu, where the bat population is expected also to be lower. So it's in the very, very early stages. We're working with arborists and wildlife biologists to design a study to see if thermal could be a viable way to detect bats in urban trees. But as of now, that is not a tool that can be used. And they recommend just only following this white paper guidance, which is no trimming during the summer unless you consult with a DLNR biologist.
Okay, we'll stay in, try to stay in touch about what your findings are with that and how that goes.
Are there any little rules of thumb for finding them in trees, or no?
They're really hard to find without a thermal camera. They are tiny. They tuck into trees. You can't really see them with binoculars unless you know exactly where they are. So no, you just kind of have to assume they could be in a tree. Like with a thermal imager, you have to go out like in that little window of when they would return to their tree after nighttime foraging. So that like 10 minutes before sunrise to before the tree warms up with the sunlight. So that could be within a half an hour after sunrise. So that's like, if you were going to use thermal imaging, that would pretty much be your only window to really detect them.
Yeah.
But otherwise, not really. The USGS study is very interesting. They had put little radio trackers on the bats to see where they went. And even when they knew the bat was in this forest stand tree, they had a hard time detecting it with thermal, and even harder time, even with thermal, detecting it with binoculars.
Wow. So we've got maybe 5 questions, so more about the bats, and then a couple others more broadly. And I know, Ryan, you've got more.
Why don't we do a couple more bat questions right now, maybe 5 more minutes, and then we'll go through the rest of the presentation.
Great.
I think maybe the fastest one is this, what constitutes a tree? I believe 15 feet tall is something I've seen in the regulations. Is that?
Yes, I should have put that in there. 15 feet woody vegetation is a tree. Even if it's like a stumped tree, if it's over 15 feet, it's still woody vegetation.
Great. If pups are disturbed and one falls out of a tree, since there isn't a nest to replace it in, you know, what's the guidance if you see a pup like that?
I don't know if that's ever happened. So I don't really know. I think you just call DLNR, your Fish and Wildlife Service, and they'd be able to direct you on what to do. I don't know if you can just go up and place it back in the tree, but I have not heard of that happening, but I can look into it to see if someone has encountered that.
So in the protocol, we'll put contact Ilana in there because she wants to know about it.
Yeah. I'd say generally probably don't touch them, because you can get in trouble for like handling endangered species if you do it the wrong way. So I'd call the DLNR number. Okay. Good question about what constitutes endangered species. How do you know that they're endangered, since it's so hard to find and monitor the population levels? And yeah, I guess the exact question was, if you don't know how many bats there are, how can you know that they're endangered?
Oh my gosh, that is like the question of any biologist that studies these species. I think the general rule is if you don't know, you just call it endangered. But it's a gray area. Like, I mean, I study a lot of birds, and there's a lot of steps to get it listed as endangered, and then once it's on this endangered list, you're supposed to collect information about them to try to improve their status so they won't be endangered anymore. But I think a lot of species got listed as endangered because there wasn't a lot known about them. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if I have an exact answer for it, but they got listed and people are researching them now to see if there is viable population sizes to consider them not. But considering they are endemic to Hawaii, there are many threats to them. They're extremely hard to study. The population numbers are pretty much guesses.
Yeah.
Probably going to be on the endangered species list for a while.
Yeah, I think we're seeing bats decline sort of all over. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that, you know, I think I have 2 things that I think that we often like sort of push up against these environmental laws and it has us sort of in these uncomfortable situations. But that, you know, these have been pretty well studied and trying to do their best to put these regulations in place. And I think advocating against them or anything like that, I think understanding, you know, the details of them is important, but that these are there for important reasons, and you know, accepting that they are what they are and that we need to find ways to work within that system is really what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I think remember that endangered, what we're talking about when we're saying something is endangered, it's actually we're referencing a very specific legal status in reference to the Endangered Species Act. And so in terms of organizing your tree care around that, those are species that are protected for, you know, lots of reasons, some ecological, some political, and that you could be in trouble for harming those species. And so we do want to be really focused on preserving those species for lots of reasons, but also holistically, our BMPs are trying to help mitigate harm to like all wildlife. I don't know if that's a good segue or not.
Yeah, I think let's continue with our sort of scheduled presentation. We should have lots of time for more discussion. Clearly, this is a really important issue to dig into and try to get every little morsel of information we can out of Ilana today. So, okay. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how we're thinking of folding Hawaii into our best management practices, and we'll bring Corey and Ilana back to talk about that a little bit. So in looking at the best management practices, there are sort of three things that we want to be looking at. You know, these non-native birds, these that are still protected, the white tern and the Hawaiian hoary bat. So we're thinking of formulating the best management practices largely around these two species, and we're working our way through this. We're going to figure it out and get you all a copy to review. Right, we're going to have a public comment period where we can get your input, and if anyone wants to join us, wants to figure out how to approach this and how to talk about it in Hawaii, please do. Please reach out to it. Corey and I are actively writing it. We're going to be working on it again next week. So just a little reminder from last week, the white tern is relatively easy to identify. It's this all white bird that's often nesting in these trees in sort of very urban Honolulu. So this is its distribution area. And so we're thinking of using this distribution area as one of the key components, but that the breeding season is sort of all over, right? That you guys don't have seasons in the way that we do here in Oregon, where there's a clearly defined breeding and non-breeding season. So when we look at trying to use this approach of hey, how risky is it that we're going to find nesting wildlife in our area, we're going to have to make pretty serious changes to this in order to make something that's going to work for Hawaii. So again, the design of this for most of the rest of the states is that in low habitat value area, during the non-breeding season, you don't need much training. Maybe a 12-minute video that we have on our website is enough. And then in other situations, hopefully this 3-week period that we set up was enough training to work in those environments. And then you really need to contact a wildlife biologist like Ilana if you're going to be working in some of the other habitats. So looking at the white tern, it seems to me like we could identify what the breeding range is from these maps, these great maps that we have on whiteterns.org, and say, if you're working outside of that year round, you probably don't need a lot of training and experience. Maybe we can jam that into a 15-minute video or something, give people just the basics. If you're going to be working inside that area, you probably need some specific white tern training in order to be able to work appropriate in those situations. And if most of our native forest birds are really pretty far out in the native forest, maybe if we're going to be working in those areas, we'd need to involve a wildlife biologist or think through something a little bit differently about how we might do that. Now, when we try to combine the white tern information in with the hoary bat information, let's look at what it would be like when we look at what Ilana was just telling us about. So it's Hawaii's only native land mammal. So it's something that's really important to the state and something that we want to make sure does not go extinct. And the recommendations on the Fish and Wildlife website, just like Ilana said, was that we're not going to do any tree care from June 1st to September 15th. And again, here it says 15 foot tall. So if that's the case, then maybe during the bat pupping season, we say there's absolutely no tree work allowed. Maybe we say, if you're going to do tree work, you're going to involve a wildlife biologist. We're trying to figure out what exactly this might say. Now, I said absolutely none allowed, right? As if we're going to regulate that. Everything in these best management practices is suggestions, right? Everything says should, it never says shall. Everything is just one approach and one way of going about this. And so we're going to be recommending something in this way, I think. We'll see exactly what this chapter turns into. But this is pretty hard to work with, and we're going to have to figure something about here, and it's probably going to evolve over time. Now, I know that a lot of you are thinking like, hey, this is crazy restrictive, this isn't happening anywhere else. And that's just flat out not true. So any project in Iowa that is funded by the Department of Transportation, which is a lot of projects in Iowa, says that from April to September, you cannot remove any trees 3 inches in diameter or greater, right? So that's a relatively similar regulation, longer time period, probably talking about smaller trees, but it depends on what exactly 3 inches are in height. And this is because there's 2 endangered bats in the state of Iowa that they're concerned about and have sort of identified these trees as critical habitat in order to ensure that they don't go extinct. Even with these regulations in place, since 2007, the Indiana bat populations have gone down 20%. And in some places, like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, they've basically gone extinct, right? We're looking at a 99% decrease in Pennsylvania. So I think that we're seeing that in lots of places, and we're seeing it all over North America. I predict that in the next 10 years, we're going to have many more bat species on the endangered species lists in all of our states, and we're going to have to all be figuring this out together, how exactly we're going to approach this as an industry to act responsibly and try to preserve habitat for some of these endangered species and not be impacting them during our tree care. So if you combine these 2 segments together, we have somewhat of a similar looking graphic, but pretty different in nature in terms of a lot of times when you'd have to contact a wildlife biologist, and entirely possible that a wildlife biologist would be telling you there's nothing we can do, right? We have to wait until and do that work starting in late September. But I'd like to sort of identify this category 2 here, right? This is our wildlife trained arborist category here, as that we want to try to make as many of these wildlife trained arborists as possible across all of our Western chapters so that we think we can be working responsibly in certain situations. So we tried to make this program so that you all would have this sort of required training in order to sort of meet that category, to meet that goal for working in Hawaii, working in these white tern areas, but we couldn't quite figure out how to do that. We couldn't quite get the field component to work. We couldn't quite get all the pieces in place. So what I think anyone who wants to, meet the best management practices in Hawaii that are going to come out in a little while, I encourage you to reach out to the Aloha Arborist Association and get on their list for some in the field training. Again, this doesn't sound like it's going to happen right now, which was part of the reason, dealing with COVID, that we struggled to schedule a field session at all and try to make this happen. But get on their list, get this last piece of this training. You've already seen, hopefully, last week's presentation and have a pretty good idea of a lot of the pieces going on. And you'll be able to get on the Aloha Arborist Association's list of people who have received this training and can act responsibly. So once we have that training, that will allow us to work up to about 10 feet away from these white tern nests. And that might feel pretty restrictive to you, right? Of like, why can't we work closer to these nests than 10 feet? They seem like they're pretty tolerant. And I'll just point out that everywhere else in the Western states, we're recommending somewhere between 100 feet and a mile for these buffer zones. So this really is a very tolerant bird and very different sort of buffer recommendations than we're going to be getting anywhere else. And so this is really quite a small space and allows us to do a lot of work. Similarly, they recommend this buddy up system, right? Where you're out there watching, one arborist is watching the bird while the other one's making cuts. And that's a relatively similar method that we're using in the best management practices, but we're generally recommending a wildlife biologist. And the reason that we're recommending that is because we have hundreds of different species that live across California, for example, and being able to know the behavioral signs of each of those different species is really complex. And when you can narrow that down to just one species of the white tern, that gives you a better chance to be able to learn enough about that rather than the hundreds of species we would have to learn to operate in California. So that's what we're thinking. Corey and I are going to chart this out with Ilana in the next couple of weeks and hope to have something out to you all to review, and we'll see how that comes together. But the last thing I want to talk about is emergencies. And I thought that last week they did a really great job of pointing out that an emergency of convenience is not a real emergency, along with giving us people to contact when you are having an emergency. So a emergency of convenience would be, I have a nest in a tree that I want to remove. That's not an emergency. That doesn't meet either of our definitions of emergency that we use in the best management practices. You know, a wildlife emergency is a tree with a nest in it failed, and I'm the first one there to respond to it, or I did everything as carefully as I could. I did a pre-work inspection, but I still, I missed something, and now I need to respond and act appropriately. These are wildlife emergencies as we frame them in the best management practices, which will differentiate between a health and human safety emergency. So we've talked about this in a couple of different ways in different places throughout this program, but that we don't want you know, people to die because of a tree failure, because we didn't know what to do with an active nest, right? There's an active nest and trees are presenting risk. What do we do about that? So our recommendation is that we have a track qualified arborist perform a full level 2 tree risk assessment, and where, you know, we fill out both sides of the form completely. We're very thorough. We have a risk rating at the end of either low, moderate, high, or extreme. Now, my super oversimplified model, this will not work for everyone in every situation, but this is how I would start thinking about it, is a low risk tree that has a nest in it. We don't remove it, right? We might remove it for other reasons, but we're not going to remove it for risk if it's low risk. If it's moderate risk, maybe in some situations we would remove that tree, but there's no reason to do it right now. We're going to do it in the non-breeding season. We're going to do it once the young have left, and there's no reason why we would have to, why waiting would be really any problem. For a high-risk tree, I'd be calling Ilana and asking her to come down and meet me and figure this out with me. I'd be asking my wildlife biologist partners to come and problem solve this situation with me, because this is a big deal. A high risk tree, we don't see that often, and we want to make sure that we're doing something about it when we do. And in an extreme risk situation, I would be responding right away. If it was absolutely necessary, I'd ask my wildlife biologist partner to come meet me on site, but I would scoop up that nest, I would take it out of the tree, I would bring it to a rehab center, I would call the authorities, I would start figuring things out, and I would mitigate that risk. I've maybe seen one tree that meets this extreme criteria, right? It's imminently failing and it's going to cause, you know, severe consequences. And so if I was in this situation, I would act, but I would assume that the wildlife agencies have a very high risk tolerance, and that if I did that for a moderate risk tree, I think that that would not be appropriate. So I have an example here from California. I believe this tree was rated an 11 in the old rating system, which would correspond roughly to high in the track system, where it was a 230-inch Monterey pine stems with a crack that was they met, the codominant stem met up above my head, and I could see light all the way through, all the way down to the base of the tree, totally cracked apart. So when we find these situations, we want to act responsibly. Our client here called their in-house wildlife biologist, called their tree crew, came together and problem solved the issue and resolved it. If we have any possibility of doing anything else, we should be doing that, right? If we can move these picnic tables, we should move them. If we can block off the area, we should do that. We should be considering all of our options, not just tree removal and tree pruning as our only way forward. When you look at this, Ilana, do you have any comments? Did this make sense? Did this not make sense? Is this should we have this discussion in a closed session where we don't have a bunch of people looking over our shoulders?
I don't think we need to have a closed session, but in terms of what the state and Fish and Wildlife recommends, even with the bat pupping season, I think they're pretty much what are gonna say don't remove the tree or trim the tree. So even like a category 3 years of training may not be appropriate at this stage. Maybe we can work on this potential thermal imaging thing, and that can change. But as of now, bat pupping season, it's pretty much a no-go on their in their perspective. And again, like, that's not to say like it's illegal to trim the tree. It's illegal to kill the bat, and to avoid any potential of harming a bat, you don't trim the tree. But that would be my comment. And back to the emergencies, like, if you consult with the DLNR biologist, and it is a true emergency situation, which does happen, especially like hurricane season in Hawaii is like during the bat pupping season. So like emergencies do happen, and they do understand that trees need to be pruned or removed for human safety during the bat pupping season, and they'll come out and evaluate if it's really necessary and can, you know, give you an okay to do so in consultation with them. But if it's like, oh, my project is delayed because we didn't get these trees trimmed, they probably won't give you a thumbs up to prune them. So
yeah, I think that's a really great point, that in a lot of our other states that we have project partners in, they recommend reaching out directly to the agencies, in particular their state wildlife agencies. We do not recommend that in California. I have not had a lot of success with that, and that's why we lean so heavily on our wildlife biologists. But if that's a good idea in Hawaii, Ilana, I think we can definitely give that recommendation of build partnership and reach out to your local wildlife agencies for sure.
yeah, in particular for the bats, like the white terns, like there's enough people that are trained now to understand how to work safely with white terns, and I mean other birds too. But if you are going to be in native forest bird habitat or Hawaiian hoary bat pupping season, contacting the state directly is important. And Fish and Wildlife gets directly involved if a project has federal funding or is on federal property with regards to the bat. So they're involved because it's an endangered species, but you won't consult with them unless you have federal money or federal property involved with the project. All other consultation will be with the state, and that was in the slides on who to call and who to contact for incidental take licenses.
Great. Well, I think I'm looking forward to working through the BMPs with you too, starting next week when I've recovered a little bit here. Corey, what do you want to talk about? What questions are people having?
Related to that, I think this is a good one from Carol. Do any level, or I guess which levels of government, if any, enforce the rules that apply to non-native invasive birds? So I think the two categories you talked about were the injurious and then the MBTA migratory birds. And then she's a little note, seems like the different levels of government have limited resources and higher priorities.
True, it's totally true. I think if you like accidentally kill the cardinal, no one's gonna come after you, even though it's technically a federal offense. I know it's terrible to say, but they don't have the resources to deal with that. But for migratory bird species that are not native, that is enforced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And for injurious birds, you can get permits to take them or call them on your property from the state of Hawaii DLNR.
Yeah, and I'll just add on top of that I think these laws and regulations are only one layer of why this is important. Enforcement is pretty low everywhere, but that our clients don't know that what species are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I'm not sure that they care. I think they want us to be acting responsibly and having us out there, knocking nests of non-native birds on the ground, I don't think is a great look. I don't think that's anything anyone wants to be doing out there.
Absolutely. All right. I think a couple of quick more bat questions. Do you have to worry about pruning palms during pupping season? Are palms trees?
Palms are considered woody vegetation. That's why they put it as woody vegetation and not trees. So there's no loophole with that. Sorry.
No palm loophole. Great.
Yeah, actually, I think a bat has been detected in one coconut tree, surprisingly. I don't know the circumstances on that, but deal on our website said that.
Do hoary bats carry rabies? And is that a reason why you shouldn't handle them?
Well, you shouldn't handle any wildlife, but Hawaii does not have rabies. And actually, I just listened to this fascinating podcast that said, yes, bats have rabies, but it's very unlikely that they will bite you and give you rabies.
Yeah, I think the percentage in California, or at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, is like way less than 1% of bats have rabies.
Yeah, but don't handle them.
I'm not advocating for people handling them. That's for sure.
They're not gonna fly in your hair and like bite your head. Like that's
like on TV. Are there maternity trees where bats continue to return year after year?
Yes, I think on the Big Island where they're like fairly well studied, there are particular trees that they come to year after year. And like, particular, some people have like lychee trees in their yards in Hilo, and they have the bats there every year. And the Arboretum in Hilo actually has a couple of maternity roost trees.
Cool.
Ilana, do they only roost sort of hanging from the branches? Do they use, like a lot of bats do, the sort of bark flange right behind in between the bark and the tree? Do they use any other places?
No, I don't think so. I think they just like tuck up into those leaves like that.
Yeah.
And yeah.
What I said yesterday, my understanding is that there's sort of 3 different strategies, right? There's cave bats, there's the sort of bark flange bat, and the hanging from the tree, the foliage bats.
Yeah, they're the hanging foliage ones. And there's actually a really cool video. They like found one of the bats, the USGS researchers found one bat in a particular tree and set up like a video camera to monitor it. And they like caught it pooping, they caught it like dropping out of the tree. It was pretty interesting. Like all the little behaviors, they can like scratch themselves, like it's pretty cool.
The number of work, don't tell my boss the number of work hours I've lost, looking at wildlife cameras online. It's the raptors and the osprey and the peregrine falcon cameras in California are amazing.
It's research. Okay, question. Several years ago, we used an Anabat. I'm not sure what that is, but I guess recording device determined there are no bat calls in the trees, that they were going to, this project was removing in line arboretum. Is that under consideration for bat monitoring? Do you know?
So the bat calls, like that could be used as more of like a long-term thing, like that there aren't really bats occurring in the area, but if it's like you need to know if there's a bat in a particular tree on a particular day, the acoustic isn't necessarily a good method because they don't always vocalize.
Yeah.
So yeah, the acoustics, it's like a long-term locational thing.
That's a great question. I had that same question, so thanks. I didn't realize that bats aren't always vocalizing.
Yeah, they aren't, and they aren't always vocalizing, and they actually can make some vocalizations that humans can hear, not always. We had like a project in Manoa that people were saying that they heard the bats all the time, and it got me curious about it. And you can hear some vocalizations, but most of them are out of our frequency. So you need those bat detectors that are analyzed. You can analyze them visually or send them off.
Cool. Yeah, Carol said.
In the chat, it says the Endabat survey was over 2 weeks.
Yeah. So it seems like if you're planning a big project that could have this kind of impact, I guess, Ilana, you're saying the recommendation is talk to DLNR and you can kind of plan mitigation with them.
Right. Yeah, you can plan mitigation with them, but yeah, the bat, if you want to know if bats are in your area, like I think they did this on the Bellows Air Force Base, which is like a beach area that is very unlikely to have bats, but they just wanted to know if they even had them in their area. They put out the acoustic detectors and didn't get any detections. So even though it is still, you know, under this big blanket of no tree trimming during the pupping season, like they can have higher confidence that if they have to do an emergency tree removal, that they're very unlikely to encounter a bat.
I'm really glad that we're talking about this because I've always felt like the mammal portion of our best management practices was really weak, and that we need to find some mammal experts to help us. So I think, Ilana, you'll be part of that solution, but I have some other contacts that I'm going to reach out to and try to build that up a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, Carol's saying that Endabat survey happened over 2 weeks, was about $1,000 and was worthwhile for their large project. So seems like that's something that as a professional you can do for part of your due diligence for those specialty projects, I guess. Another interesting one is I've heard of a situation where a cattle egret ran into the drop zone on a site and got a broken neck from a falling branch. Would a tree care company be held responsible for that cattle egret's broken neck?
We can start with a caveat of none of us are lawyers here.
Yeah.
Would you like to take a stab at that before me, Ilana?
I don't know about that one, but cattle egrets are really interesting in Hawaii because they are technically protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but they're also injurious wildlife. So that one's weird. I think to kill one, you need to have a permit to do it.
You would have needed an incidental take permit beforehand or something, right?
Yeah, you would have needed a permit to remove it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, my answer would be yes, but that enforcement's pretty low, and I think everyone understands that we're trying to do the best we can, right? So I don't think we're expecting to have anything in place where we can guarantee 100% that we're not going to impact any nesting wildlife, but you know, these sorts of situations are going to pop up. We're out there working on trees every day of the year across 4 states. We're gonna have some wildlife emergencies, and it's really too bad, but I don't think we're gonna come up with any practices that eliminate 100% of our impact.
So I have a question for Ilana. I'm wondering, Ilana, if there are any known nocturnal predators of the adult bats or the pups?
I don't know if rats impact bat pups. That's something I could look into. That would be the only thing I could think of. I guess cats could too in the trees, but I have a feeling cats more like ground predators at night than tree predators, but I don't know. It would be cats, rats, mongoose maybe. Those aren't nocturnal, but those could impact the trees through the day. But like the bats are out at night, so the pups could be vulnerable as the mother's feeding. But in the daytime, like, yeah, cats could be an issue too.
There are no owls on Hawaii?
We have owls. We have short-eared owls. We have a native one and then invasive barn owl. I don't think there's been a documentation of them taking bats. They probably do, but I don't know if it's been really documented. The owls barn owls in particular affect seabirds. They predate seabird chicks and waterbird chicks. and mongoose.
In my research on the Hawaiian hoary bat for today, it was just like everywhere led you to like, we don't have any research on this. It was like, we don't have any research on this. It was like, it's endangered because we don't have any research on anything. It was like, it's kind of funny how often it said that in what I was looking at.
Yeah, it's really hard to study these bats since they're so cryptic. I mean, you can see them visually like at night flying around, but like where they're spending their day or tracking them back to certain trees has been really challenging, and even estimating populations have been challenging because you can't find them. So you're basing your population estimates on acoustic data, which could be one bat circling an acoustic detector 50 times and calling. So is that 50 bats or is that one bat? It's really hard to study these guys. Yeah, it's not like you can go to a cave and count them.
Yeah.
They're really solitary.
Corey, can we change gears a little bit? I'm interested in insects. And do you two know anything about insects? What's the status of native insects in Hawaii?
Specifically, from the question about the Kamehameha butterfly and all insects and any native, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know very much about native insects, sadly. I think that's one of the things I want to learn a lot more about. But yeah, we have the Kamehameha butterfly, Pulelehua. There's also some endangered damselflies and dragonflies that are being reared. Again, the snails, those are insects. But I think of them as insects sometimes. There's a lot of interesting little native bugs. There's the happy face spiders are pretty cool. I don't know if
I think there's anything specifically like that arborists need to keep in mind about sensitivities about insects, like in terms of their range or pesticide use, like as
I don't know in particular about.
It's okay when we can just admit that we're out of our depth. One of the things I've been doing in my free time is building bee hotels, like little for mason bees and other things. So I think that's been a fun way to start seeing more of my insect community in my yard. So.
Oh yeah, the comment about Blackburn Sphinx moth. Yeah, that's on the outer islands. That's endangered moth that is again hard to detect, but really like those tobacco plants.
Interesting.
I'd advocate. I often find insect stuff related in like more horticulture, landscape, pesticide use type areas, because those industries are getting really active in like pollinator habitats, right? So I'm finding the groups that are active on pollinator habitats to be good for have relevant knowledge for arborists, I think, on how to protect and promote insects in your work. Yeah.
Yeah, I can look into that more. I know several people that specialize in like our native insects. So I can try the butterflies, damselflies, the yellow-faced bee. So I'll try to get more information and we can put it in our tree care for birds and wildlife.
I have a question about native, non-native, injurious, and then protected birds, right? Of like how long are those lists, right? Are we talking about many species that are going to be hard to differentiate from one another? And what's the best resource for like figuring out whether it's injurious or not and its protected status?
Yeah, so the deal in our website, so there's actually two separate lists of injurious. There's federal has some, and then the state of Hawaii has even more. So the state of Hawaii one, if you're not really familiar with birds and bird families, might be a little challenging because it's like everything in this family is injurious and everything in this family and everything in this family except this one or this particular one. So kind of have to do a lot of Googling to figure out what particular ones are in Hawaii and on the injurious list. But it is you can just Google injurious wildlife Hawaii and the DLNR document comes up, and it has all the different statuses for the animals. There's like, it has endangered, it has introduced, I think native, and you just scroll down, and I think it's at the end of the document that has specifics about injurious wildlife.
And the federal injurious bird list that has Hawaii injurious birds on it, where is that housed?
Again, I just Google federal injurious wildlife, and it's a separate thing that covers the entire US, and you just kind of pick and choose which ones are in Hawaii.
I think that's pretty interesting. I think we'll have to spend some time with that when we're figuring out how to present this information and make it digestible.
Yeah, we can, I mean, it can go through and actually make it easier for people to know if they're not familiar with like birds and don't want to do all the Googling. Maybe that's something we can add in the BMPs, just so it's very clear which birds are considered these certain things. And yeah, the injurious thing, again, it's you do need a permit. Even though it is bad, you do need a permit to kill them.
And for the record, you two, we have draft chapters from both Arizona and Nevada, so Hawaii's got to get it together now. I see one in the chat here, Corey, of talking about these behavior design defined buffer zones, right? If I had said 10 feet, but really you can get closer than that if the white tern is not reacting, is sort of behaving as if it's not stressed. And how are we managing that throughout the larger aspects of the BMPs and things and other types of wildlife? So for other birds in other areas, we basically have established quite large buffers of 100 feet or larger generally, and have recommended that a wildlife biologist be involved in making those smaller if they're going to go any smaller than that. And that the main reason for this is that there are just so many different birds out there that have such different sensitivities that we couldn't train everyone in all of that. Like, I don't even know, most of the sensitivities and, half the birds that we have in the Western chapter here. So I think that we're relying more heavily on the wildlife biologist to be able to first say how sensitive those species are, and then monitor the nest while work is actually taking place to be able to do that behavior defined buffer zone, right? Of like, it seems like it's fine, keep getting closer. It seems like it's like, oh no, they're getting stressed out, bring it back. But we're really not giving them much guidance on that. We're allowing the wildlife biologist to use their specialty to determine how they want to approach that themselves. And then for other wildlife, like I said, this has been a pretty weak point for us. I think we've largely said that there aren't buffers designed for non-bird wildlife. So for example, squirrels, if there's an eastern fox squirrel, which is not native to California, I would probably that has young in the nest, I would try to leave that nest there, but I wouldn't really worry about any size buffer zone. Removing a branch 5 feet away from that, I don't think is likely a problem. But I don't know. I don't know how exactly people are managing that or should manage that. You have any other thoughts, Corey?
I just also like to throw in also that there are, we don't touch on this too much in the BMPs, but the generally avoiding situations where you would be like harassing or inducing harm that would be considered animal cruelty. Those are the situations where you're trying to avoid too. So just, yeah, I guess that's it depends type of an answer. This is I don't know if this is a nice one to wrap up on, but question is, how are tree care companies supposed to stay in business if you can't work from June 1st through September 15th?
Corey, you want to kick this off for us? What are you thinking? I
would kick that off with saying that dealing with these types of guidance from wildlife agencies was actually the impetus for the whole Tree Care for Bird project when it started 4 or 5 years ago. And that we've created this group and network and program of biologists, Audubon advocates, state, federal, and then also tree care companies to try and come together and create these BMPs so that we can all acknowledge that there's a way for tree care professionals to be really responsible around wildlife and not harm them. And we're all working in this murky space of guidance that's sometimes conflicting from different levels of government, and that, you know, personal opinion, as long as you're not, you just have to be guided by not harming wildlife. And that I think that we're trying to figure out all the little minutiae of the situations, but I think that
well said, Corey. Yeah, I think that the only thing I'd add is that was one of the reasons we started, right? That wasn't my reason for getting involved. It was several other people's reason for getting involved.
That's true. That was one of the tipping points of many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ilana, do you have any thoughts on that? Any closing thoughts you want to make if this is going to be our last question?
Yeah, obviously that's a huge issue, and why I'm trying to see if there's a possible avoidance protocol we can develop in conjunction with the state and Fish and Wildlife and tree care companies, using wildlife biologists to survey for bats. And you know, the state here, things are slow going, and getting things approved is tough. But I would say, like, maybe as a tree care organization, more advocacy for wanting this protocol and BMPs to happen with the state gives them more reason to move forward with a study that could help mitigate, I mean, not mitigate, but avoid take of bats while continuing tree trimming. So it's on my mind, it's on a lot of people's mind. And I think if more of us speak up about it, I mean, first, are aware of it. A lot of people aren't even aware about the bat guidelines, but speak up that it's a problem in terms of human safety for a lot of cases, and that we want to be good for bats. You know, it's not like we want to harm bats, but we want to do our best and also continue working. So yeah, it's in progress, and if anyone wants to be involved or be more of a motivator to help get these protocols established, let me know. I'm working on it.
Yeah, keep Corey and I involved in that. I think I also heard you say funding, right? We should be funding this research.
Yeah, we'll need funding to do this study for sure. And I think Jolie with Aloha Arborists has some ideas. I don't think we're at that stage yet. This is definitely more of a long-term thing, but it will need funding to do this study to see if it's possible to use thermal to detect bats.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing some preliminary results from that, so definitely stay in touch with it. Ilana, I think we managed to take half an hour of content and an hour of discussion and fill our entire time here. So Corey, thanks so much. Do you have anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, thank you so much. It's really great I miss Hawaii, so it's nice to pretend to be there for an hour and a half. So aloha, everyone.
This has maybe been the hardest presentation for me to have missed traveling in person. I was so excited to visit all these beautiful places. So bummed we're doing it over the internet, but also really grateful that we were able to connect at all. It's a weird time right now. But thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and we will hopefully see you soon.